Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time up, I have part one of two, my conversation with Neil Druckmann, the creative director over at Naughty Dog, a company probably best known for the Uncharted games. This conversation took place on May 18th, 2016. If you like what you hear, please give me a little bit of love on the Patreon. And if you'd like to read a full transcript of the interview, click the link in the description below.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi, this is Neil from Naughty Dog.
Hey, Neil, it's Dave. How you doing?
Good, how you doing?
Good. Do you have any questions for me before we get started on this interview? Like who I am or what this is about or why I mentioned Kevin Ott?
Sure, yeah. Who are you? What is this interview about?
Sure. Well, so I'm a longtime entertainment journalist. I'm a former editor for NBC and The Onion. Sort of late 2014, started a oral history interview series project. Started doing a mix of workforce journalism, ethnography, just sort of also recent anthropology. Just sort of trying to look at video games through a lens of people who make them, less so about the products that sit on shelves. So it's trying to humanize a lot of things. So it exists as like a edited transcript of a Q&A on my project that I use to pitch to be articles for other outlets. And Kevin, I just know from when I was living in LA a couple of years ago through the WGA when he was still at the WGA.
Okay.
So does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, cool. So basically, in the course of this, and at least like when we start off, I'll ask you to sort of give a context for yourself for people who maybe aren't familiar with you or your games. But from there, we'll sort of dive into more nuanced questions. But I'm ready to go if you are.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Cool. Thanks for making the time. So all we need to get started is, can you please give me your full name, your age, where you're based out of, and for people who aren't familiar with you, can you just talk a little bit about how you intersect with the games industry?
Sure. My name is Neil Druckmann, and I am the creative director at Naughty Dog. I'm also a writer. I live and work out of Santa Monica. Naughty Dog is located in Santa Monica, and I guess my whole life intersects with video games. I've been in the games industry now for 12 years. All 12 of them have been at Naughty Dog, and I've worn different hats throughout the years, from programmer to designer to lead designer to writer to now being creative director. And have worked most recently on The Last of Us and Left Behind, DLC for The Last of Us, and most recently is Uncharted 4, Thief's End.
Yeah, so first question I have down here is just, so are you exhausted right now, or?
I was. I'm somewhat well rested now. Usually when we finish a project, everyone is pretty burnt out. The last few months of a project can be quite grueling. But this is kind of, for me, is the fun part of, the pace is kind of light. You're not feeling the stress. It's early ideas for the next project.
Yeah.
Different people on the team like different aspects or different parts of the project. For me, I really like the blank canvas. There's something that I really enjoy there. And that's where I'm at now, so that's a lot of fun.
So, what does the job of being a creative director at like a big budget game company or studio, like what does that actually entail?
That's a good question. I guess it depends where we are in production. So early on, it's working closely. I have a directing partner, Bruce Straley, who's the game director, although we kind of just see each other as co-directors at this point. So it's working closely with him at the pre-production, early production part to figure out, okay, what is this game that we're making? What is it about? What are we trying to say with this game? And sometimes to answer that question, we have to dive in and just start fleshing out the ideas of the game. There's what we call the macro, which is on the high level, is like, where are we going, who are the characters that we're meeting, what are the different locations, what are the different mechanics that are coming in at different parts of the game. So we try to flesh that out as much as possible so we have a beginning, middle, and end. Once we feel confident in that, then the next part of being a director is pitching that vision, that idea to the team. So we'll now the team is so big it doesn't fit in one room, but we'll bring in all the leads of different departments and pitch them on the story and the experience. I guess let me back up. So part of putting that pitch together is working with concept artists. So trying to call out the important parts or points of the story, and then getting images for those, whether it's locations or some kind of narrative climax or some kind of new gameplay mechanic. But we really try to get as many visuals so people can, in their mind, close their eyes and imagine themselves playing this game and experiencing these high points of the game. Mm-hmm. And we will pitch it to all the leads, answer any questions they might have as much as we can at that point. Then it's more managerial stuff. Is like, okay, what's the makeup of the team? Is there somebody that, is there something about the pipeline that we need to change? Those will be kind of big discussions early on of, okay, we have this idea for this game. What does this mean for tech? So it's meeting with programmers and saying, okay, this is, for example, for Uncharted 4, we realized we're going to have much more open levels, bordering on kind of open world kind of scale, and we didn't have the streaming tech for stuff like that. So it's like, okay, well, how do we even put something like that together? What is the roadmap for having the tech to making a level like this?
Yeah.
Then,
that was something. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, maybe we could jump into details. So
Well, yeah, that was sort of in line with something I did want to ask you about, which is like, I think Naughty Dog has a reputation, or at least this is what I've heard through the years, is that you guys seem pretty free to do whatever you want. And so I know you just had a game come out, and so I don't want to ask you a question that seems kind of bittersweet, but what do you feel are sort of the limitations of, the big budget game design model?
What are the limitations? Well, what comes to mind is, and I don't really have this problem, is like if you're attracted to a certain kind of idea that on its own is niche, meaning it's not going to have a large audience, then it's hard to justify making a big budget game. And, obviously the more niche the idea is, the more risky it becomes. So if we wanted to do, I don't know, just a horseback riding game that has no combat or no tension, but that's going to have a budget of Uncharted 4, then that game is probably not going to make its money back.
Yeah.
Luckily, I'm drawn to certain ideas and concepts that, at least for the time being, happen to have a certain kind of mass appeal, and we have a track record of being successful. That I don't run necessarily into that issue. There's times where I think, like, have you played Uncharted 4?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so there's situations where, like, okay, we're going to have this really slow opening to establish these characters, and we want to spend a big part of our budget to show mundane life in an action-adventure game. And those are things that might not pan out and on paper can look very risky. That at Naughty Dog, I guess we're pretty fortunate that Sony is hands-off creatively, that we can take those risks in a big-budget game, and where I could see other teams, and from anecdotes that I've heard, that producers, executives, marketing people would get nervous seeing a big chunk of the game being that, and not being big explosions, the stuff you could imagine the average gamer being into. But I kind of like challenging what that concept is of what people would be into. I think if it's compelling enough, they could be into all sorts of experiences that aren't obvious mass appeal. That kind of makes sense.
And I think it's interesting too, because I think in an example like Uncharted 4, this sort of is a continuation of I think something you guys have strived for a long time is relatable characters, but you still do have that thing in Uncharted 4 anyway, where you have relatable characters, but they are still running around and shooting guns. I have shot guns in my life. I've never shot a person. I mean, speaking of, challenging conventions, I mean, do you think that, I mean, maybe that's just sort of the question is like, why do you think like in these bigger budget games, we're always still running around shooting guns?
I think people are drawn to conflict. I think great stories are told with conflict, and conflict can happen on different levels. There's this kind of existential or external conflict where your life is in danger, and guns are a quick way to represent that, right? You say you have a shotgun, but you haven't necessarily shot a person, but I'm sure you have heard of stories of people getting shot, and you could imagine the tension that comes from that. Then you
I could imagine, yeah.
And then you're going to have personal conflict between characters, and that's the stuff we're getting more into. And then internal conflict of who am I as a person, philosophically, what drives me. And we try with our games to hit every level of conflict.
Yeah.
And I think that's just part of, specifically for Uncharted and that genre, it's part of a heritage of storytelling, of taking worldwide conflict and simplifying it and stylizing it so it doesn't have the same weight as, let's say, real-world violence. And the example I like to use is, Indiana Jones shoots and kills people with little remorse. But it doesn't have you don't feel like, oh man, he should have like post-traumatic stress disorder, having just shot that guy that had that big sword in Raiders.
Yeah.
Or having shot and killed all those Nazis and just blew them up with an RPG and then kind of crack a joke with his dad. And you just buy into it because it is just part of this simplified version of reality that just kind of pokes at those conflicts. Versus, so you have those Nazis in Indiana Jones versus the Nazis in Schindler's List, which have a very different weight and a very different tone. And I kind of compare those, not to say we're of the degree of artistry of those films, but the difference between The Last of Us and Uncharted, I think The Last of Us, despite having infected and zombie-like creatures, the violence, the weight of the violence is closer to our reality, our world, whereas in Uncharted, it's much more stylized, and I hate to use this term, but it just comes to my mind, comic book-y.
Yeah.
And it is just part of the fun romp of the history of pulp action adventure stories.
And I do get the sense that is something you guys try to do, is to try to push and tell, different types of stories or use different types of characters. What sort of, what tools in the storytelling toolbox, if you will, do you think game designers sort of underutilize, or what storytelling tools do you think are overutilized?
I would say the part we were talking about earlier, the external conflict is overutilized. It is kind of a go-to of saying like, oh, I want to create tension, so let me have people chasing you and shooting at you and blowing stuff up. But it's kind of like eating candy, and at some point you just get numb to it, and you start getting nauseous if you're just eating the same kind of candy over and over and over. And where I think the stuff that's underutilized, and it's in a lot of ways it's harder to pull off, are those downbeats where you are moving yourself away from that external conflict and moving more into these personal, social, internal conflicts. Because I think there it's harder to find the gameplay. There's less of a heritage of gameplay in those areas, and you have to start looking into indie games or early adventure games to find examples of people exploring that space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, for us, I think, over the last 2-3 games, we've gotten more and more confident in those areas, to the point where it's interesting to look at the reaction for Uncharted 4, because there's some people that are pushing back to say, you've gone too far. There are too many down moments in Uncharted 4. I don't have enough action. I don't have enough kind of explosion shooting. And then other people would say, they totally appreciate it. And this truly feels more of an adventure game than an action game. They're more invested in the characters than they've ever been. And it's just an interesting, I don't really have a takeaway to say, oh, we've done something right or we've done something wrong. It's just, that's where we are as developers. That's the stuff that's exciting us at the moment. And that's, Uncharted 4 is an example of that, of just our evolution as, I guess, storytellers, game designers.
I mean, what I think, like, for people who are sort of on the quote unquote outside of games, who don't really pay attention to video games, just like I think like all they see is, shouting and shooting and running around. I'd be curious to hear, like, what big budget games do you think of that you feel like say something about what it means to be human?
Yeah, what comes to mind is Half-Life 2. I know I'm going kind of back time.
Yeah.
But I still draw from that game, and there's moments in Half-Life 2. There's moments that are kind of awkward with the way games have evolved, of playing this silent protagonist that doesn't speak, and it is a little odd, I think, nowadays. But there are moments with Alex that, to me, Alex was kind of one of the first grounded human characters that I felt like through gameplay, through just traversing the world with her and hearing her react to it, I was making a connection with.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt when she was sad, I was celebrating with her when we accomplished something. When I see her kind of throwing a ball to this big robot named Dog and having fun with him, it felt like a person doing it. There's moments where I forget this is a game scripted by, a team of developers, and stringing together a bunch of animations and editing a bunch of lines that were recorded probably at different dates. You forget all that and you just see Alex. You just see this person, and we are constantly striving for that. And I think people who have been outside of games maybe don't realize the kind of personal connections that can exist in games. And just as an anecdote, and kind of relates to the WGA, is I'm on the board of the Writers Guild Foundation.
Mm-hmm. And
I've been brought on as the first video game writer to be on that board. And part of it was just to educate the other board members and show them how far games have come. And all I did really was I brought, they asked me to do a meeting or just a presentation of giving an example. And I brought The Last of Us, which I don't know if you've played.
Yeah.
But so I just played the first 15 minutes from the opening until Sarah dies. And I turned the lights back on. I could just see people's jaws are open because they didn't realize, you could tell this kind of stories in games. And then they started asking me questions like, well, what other stories can you tell in games? Like, can you tell a nuanced political thriller? Can you tell, a romantic comedy? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Their imagination and what you kind of are drawn to and what you want to make, and obviously getting the funding for it. But if you do it right, you can connect with characters, I believe, more strongly, more powerfully than even in passive mediums like film or TV.
Mm-hmm. I mean, are there types of stories you feel like we still don't see in video games that you'd like to see?
And that's getting harder and harder to say yes, because I think there might not be big budget games, but I think of Gone Home, and I think of what a beautiful story that is, about a teenage girl's growing up and finding herself and her sexual identity. And, that would be a weird statement to make even a few years ago, to say, here's a game that was on a bestsellers list and won a bunch of awards. More so I would say, I'd love to see those kind of themes explored in big budget games, and third person kind of, even the stuff we're trying to do as action games. I hope we have an influence on that kind of stuff.
I mean, where do you feel like your games fit in the landscape of the bigger budget games? Like how where do you feel like what sort of niche are you guys satisfying, or just where do you feel like you fit in that landscape?
I think, yeah, it's I don't know how to answer this without kind of tooting our own horn, but I think we put story first, and I think for the most part that's rare in AAA games. As much as people do that lip service, it's one thing to say, we hired a big time screenwriter from Hollywood than to say we're going to construct our whole pipeline, our decision-making process around the story and the characters, and we're going to throw away lots of fun gameplay ideas if they don't fit the story. And likewise, we're going to get rid of stories, and the story's going to evolve if you can't play it. If no matter how great the story is, and The Last of Us is an example of that, where the story went through several iterations until we landed on something that felt like this is not only a great story, this is a story you could play, and now we can construct it. And now everything has to match this tone, everything has to be about the characters. And when we talk about levels, most of the time we're not talking around, okay, this level is going to introduce this mechanic, and what are the different fun ways we could use this mechanic. It's more about when you enter Pittsburgh, this level is about building trust between Joel and Ellie. And now what are the different mechanics we could build and evolve that are going to better and better build that trust between these two characters, because we know at the end of it we want to maybe throw a wrench into that relationship and break that trust. So there's going to be some character payoff for all these mechanics that we're building. And I think so far when people try to copy what we do, that's the element that they miss. And I remember when we did Uncharted 2, Uncharted 2 was kind of revolutionary in how we approach set pieces and spectacle. But I think more than that is the reason Uncharted 2 works so well is because those were all tied with interesting characters that you cared about. So when you're on this big moving train and it's graphically impressive, and you're enjoying the thrill ride, the adrenaline rush, more so than that, you're caring about it because at the end of the train is Chloe, this person that double-crossed you, and yet you really care about her and you have these conflicted feelings towards. And I think people all the times copy the surface part of what we do, which is the spectacle, and miss this kind of more internal soul of those moments.
So there was I don't know if you read, there was a Q&A, I think late last year with Charlie Kaufman. I want to say it was in Vulture, where he was talking about sort of his perception of TV comedy, how it worked before he started getting jobs writing for TV. So I'll sort of paraphrase a quote from him where he's talking about, from the outside, you look at the stories that are told and you just assume people are really bad at their jobs, but then when you get in, you realize you sort of have to dumb it down, and there's just a lot of really amazing, talented comedy writers in there who are sort of just getting paid to adhere to the formula of whatever works that they can sell advertising against. So I'd be curious to hear you talk about sort of, people from the outside, be they media or critics or writers or fans, sort of, what do you think people from the outside don't understand about the way that, AAA video game stories, the stories actually come together?
I think people that don't make games have a hard time understanding what a miracle it is for a game to come together, especially like one of these big budget games where you have multiple studios around the world making content and material that all has to come together. When we finished Uncharted 4, we told the team, it's like, the fact that we just finished this game is a miracle. Like, the fact that this thing actually came together and you could play it from beginning to end is such an impossible task. And then to go above that and actually have it make sense, and then to go above that and actually have it have some kind of emotional resonance is, I honestly don't even know how that happens. I struggle with kind of comprehending that.
Are there like a couple of maybe without giving away the secret sauce or whatever, just minute details or examples of ways that the stories come together?
Well, the thing that we talk about is that's having a plan is so important, and like that macro, that initial pitch, that if that pitch works, you're walking someone through the story, and they're emotionally moved from that pitch, and they get what the story's about and what it's trying to convey, that then when you dive in and you're looking at like a jump or like a part where Sam hands Nate the rope and there has to be some brotherly competitive nature, and you're just doing so much work to just make that beat land, and like have a line that has like a little bit of humor behind it work effectively, you kind of lose the forest from the trees, and you just have to have trust that initial plan is going to, as long as like we keep refining all these beats aren't working, once we hit alpha and the whole game is strung together. This is a quick tangent. Alpha for me is the worst part of production, because now it's like you can play the whole game and see how none of it works. You have this impossible task in front of you with very limited time. Like, now, how do we make all of this work, this 17-hour monstrosity, and then there's no time to like step back and look at the whole thing holistically. You just have to say, okay, that initial plan is just have faith in that and trust it, and just go through the game and beat by beat give feedback and work with the team to try to make those beats land and do what they're supposed to do. And you go through the whole game and you finish one pass, and you go back to the beginning and you go through the whole game again and you do another pass and you go back to and you just keep doing that until someone says you're out of time, and then you release and then you put that out to the public. And then you hope, because you've been on this game for years and you have no idea anymore if it works or not. And like people tell me, like, oh, when you finish the game, you knew it was great, right? You knew you would review it. I was like, no, I didn't. Like, if the game would have reviewed like, I'd be surprised if it reviewed poorly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it reviewed average, because I have no concept anymore of what this game is. All I had was like the faith that the initial plan would work, and I think that's what people sometimes don't understand. Like, and they think like, oh, when like some narrative, they sometimes will look at like a minor narrative beat. I'm trying to think of an example of something people have picked on recently with Uncharted 4. This is a weird kind of example, but I'll use it.
Sure.
There's a part at the end where Nate has to leave Elena and Sullivan. And this is sometimes where you're building things in isolation of other things. So we capture this scene where there is a vertical distance, and there's a time pressure that then says Elena and Sullivan can't join Nate, so Nate has to go off on his own. At the time when we constructed that, we thought Nate wouldn't have his rope with him. And because things are sometimes done in isolation, the level afterwards had all this kind of interesting traversal with the rope. And we're like, okay, so we have to give him the rope back. And now people, when we focus this at that scene, they watch that scene, they're like, oh, but he has this rope, but they can't climb up, even though he's got this. We're like, well, and we're trying to justify it to ourselves. We're like, well, you can only use the rope on these very specific icons. That's the mechanical way of using the rope. But in a narrative space, or logically, it's like, well, you can just lower the rope for them. And we realized this pretty late in production. So we can't change the scene. We can't change the level afterwards. So really the only thing we could do is try to get your mind off of it. So during that cutscene, if you play it now, you just see Nate doesn't have the rope on his hip. And doing that, for most people, and I would say 90% at least, they don't think about it, because we just took the rope off only for the cutscene, and then we give it back to you right after the cutscene. But there's people that do notice it, and they're like, oh, what the fuck? Why would you do that? Just come up with something else. Like, it's clearly a problem. It's like, yes, it's clearly a problem in hindsight, but when you're producing this thing and you have to worry about 100 other moments that aren't working to a worse degree than this, all you could do really is that problem, just Band-Aid, stick it in together as best as you can and move on. Otherwise, you'll just be iterating on this game for another year.